All right, guys. This set of notes is entitled Industrial Workers. Was the rise of industry good for American workers? We've been talking about this time period, 1865 into the early 1900s, as an age of innovation and invention, where we're seeing the rise of big business, we're seeing explosion in the amount of industrial work being done, exports are going up, and we've talked about whether this overall was a good thing for the United States. Today, we're going to kind of begin narrowing our focus to look specifically at was it good for American workers, the working class, the average citizens living in the United States at the time. So it's important to understand the role that labor or workers played in the rise of industry. The industrial growth that the United States is going through during this time period is partly due to the large amount of workers that there were. There was a very large labor supply in the United States, number of workers available to work, which means that businesses could hire them for cheap. And it was very easy to find labor when you needed to because there were so many people looking for work at the time. And there's a lot of reasons why this large labor supply existed. First of all, we're seeing a lot of people moving away from the farms and moving into the cities. Over 8 million workers are going to leave their farms and move to these urban areas, to cities in search of work, often industrial work in these factories. So a large number of people are leaving agricultural work behind and moving to the cities. And we're also seeing a large number of immigrants coming into the United States looking for work. Between 1860 and 1900, around 14 million immigrants come to the United States in search of work. To be a worker was conditions weren't great. Working conditions were poor. They were often dangerous and dirty, difficult conditions. And child labor was a very common practice. To be an average worker, you were not treated well. The machines themselves oftentimes were dangerous and could cause injury. You were often asked to work 12, 14-hour days, 5 or 6 days in a row. You were doing so with very little pay. Accidents were very common. Fires were common. And during this time period, a fire in a building, if you're one of there's no fire escapes. There's no quickest path to the exit. Fires were very, very dangerous things and oftentimes led to a lot of people dying. You can see this picture as a part of a series of really famous pictures done by a photographer named Lewis Hine that worked to kind of expose how common child labor was at the time. It was very, very common for a child living in one of the major cities to be working several days a week for just as many hours as adults were, doing jobs that were just as difficult and dangerous. So many workers were not pleased with their work and their working conditions, and some of them tried to set up labor unions. A union is just a group of people who, in the same sort of work, have come together, unified, and are trying to use their collective power as a large group to get better working conditions, better pay, better hours for themselves and their fellow employees. That's generally the idea of a union. By combining your forces together, you have a larger bargaining stake. One person arguing with the boss doesn't really mean much, but if all of the workers come together and argue with the boss, maybe things could change. But in general, unions are not particularly successful during this time period, partly because if unions, their most typical bargaining chip is that they could go on strike, they could leave the job. But there's so many workers during this time period, it's very easy for businesses to find new workers if people do leave. So unions would use a variety of strategies, but in general, they're not particularly successful. The most famous strategy, though, that unions are going to use are strikes. Strikes are when workers refuse to work. They go on strike. They often walk out of the factory and protest outside the factory, demanding a change, better conditions, better pay, better hours. Um, but during this time period, most of these strikes are failing. Um, because the business owners would oftentimes bring in private guards. The picture here, you can see the guards are at the bottom of the picture. These are Pinkertons, a group we're going to talk about, who are private guards come in to bring about an end to this strike. Sometimes also police and army were brought in to deal with these strikes. And oftentimes they did so with violence. They would violently put down these strikes. And so most employers refused to bargain with these unions, refused to give in to their demands when they strike. And oftentimes what employers would do is they would blacklist union leaders. So if you are a worker and you try to organize your fellow workers into a union, get everyone together so that you can collectively bargain and bring about change, the employer would fire you. And then they would blacklist you, go about making sure that nobody else, no other businesses would hire you to keep you from, this discourages people from wanting to start a union.